What if the home you poured your life into could become the key to your freedom? What if a single, long-forgotten deed held the power to rewrite your story? And what if that moment of discovery could spark hope for countless others who feel unseen, keen thick YouTube? In the next hour, you'll learn how silent sacrifice can transform into lasting impact. You'll uncover practical steps to reclaim your dignity and secure what's rightfully yours. And you'll witness how one woman's quiet courage built a community of belonging. Kian Thuk, YouTube. So have you ever wondered what happens when respect replaces obligation? Before we dive in, let me share how a grandmother's simple decision lit the spark for something much bigger. It always starts with a small moment, one you never expect will stay with you forever. For Ruth, it was an ordinary evening. The table was set with chipped plates and humble food meatloaf, overcooked peas and bread she'd sliced herself that morning. She took her usual seat a little slower now, her joints stiff from the climb down the stairs. Across from her sat her son, Jason, once a boy she had carried on her hip. Beside him, Samantha, her daughter-in-law, whose sharp words had grown more frequent with each passing week. And next to her, her grandson, too young to understand the currents swirling through the room. Dinner began in silence until suddenly it wasn't. You eat, but you don't help. The words hung in the air, thick as smoke. Samantha's voice didn't rise, but it cut deep, designed to wound, not warn. Ruth's fork hovered mid-air. Across the table, Jason kept eating, not a glance, not a word, not a defense. In that moment, his silence shouted louder than Samantha's cruelty. And Ruth. She didn't argue. She didn't explain about her aching back or the arthritis that stiffened her fingers. She didn't remind them of the decades she had held this family together. Through sickness, through sleepless nights, through years when love felt like the only currency they had left. She simply set her fork down, gathered the dishes, and moved quietly through the room, her dignity intact, even when her heart cracked. But beneath that composed surface, something shifted. It wasn't rage. It wasn't sadness. It was the weight of years of giving now disregarded in a single sentence. You eat, but you don't help. For so many elders, this moment, whether whispered in a kitchen or screamed in a hospital room, is heartbreakingly common. According to a 2023 National Alliance for Caregiving report, nearly 25% of American seniors experience some form of emotional neglect or verbal shaming in their own families. For those providing unpaid labor across a lifetime, such words become an erasure not just of value, but of identity. In Ruth's case, it marked the quiet start of a new chapter, one where respect would no longer be begged for, but earned, reclaimed, and ultimately rebuilt. But before she could take her first true step toward freedom, Ruth, like so many others, had to confront a deeper truth, the invisible years. All the hours, dollars, tickets, and sacrifices that families so easily forget. Have you ever noticed how the most important work is often the work no one talks about? It's not written in resumes, it doesn't show up in bank accounts, but it lives in the folds of well-worn blankets, the scent of Sunday dinners, the patched knees of little Jeans, the whispered prayers over sleeping children. For Ruth, those were the years that stretched behind her like an endless quilt of sacrifice. She remembered them clearly, that sleepless night after the dinner table betrayal, lying awake in the tiny care home room, staring at the ceiling fan, clicking softly overhead. She remembered the early mornings at the dry cleaners, working double shifts to cover Jason's school supplies. The nights she stayed up sewing buttons onto his uniform so he'd look sharp on the first day of class. She remembered how when her husband fell ill, it was her hands, tired as they were, that bathed him, dressed him, fed him, comforted him. When the house threatened to fall apart, It was her creativity that kept it stitched together with tape string and coupons clipped from yellowing newspapers. There was no applause for these moments, no ledger, no thank you cards. But without them, the family's life would have unraveled long ago, and Ruth's story is far from unique. According to a Pew Research Center study, more than 50% of American women over 60 have provided some form of unpaid caregiving in their lifetime. Yet less than one-third feel their contributions are acknowledged by family members. It's called invisible labor, the unseen, uncounted work that sustains families often at great personal cost. What happens when that labor is forgotten? Women like Ruth often face an erasure of identity. Once the heart of the home, they are later treated as burdens simply because they can no longer bend to scrub a floor. And here's a painful truth. Most families do not track the value of what has been given until the giving stops. That's why Ruth's leather-bound notebook was so powerful. It wasn't a ledger of revenge. It was a record of love. Page after page, she had quietly noted the thousands of dollars spent, the emergencies, answered the birthday parties, funded the hospital bills, paid without hesitation. More than $120,000 given without expectation of return. And yet all it took was one dinner, one insult to reduce her to someone who eats. If you've ever found yourself nodding to this, if you've ever felt the weight of years, no one seems to remember. Know this, you are not alone. But there is a way to reclaim that value, not in anger, but in clarity. Document. Remember. Protect. Because when the day comes, as it did for Ruth, you will need to hold your story in your hands, not simply in your heart. And for Ruth, that day was closer than she knew. Because in the very next chapter of her journey, a long-forgotten legal truth would come to light, one that would change everything. Sometimes the loudest decision in life is made in silence. For Ruth, that decision came 2 mornings after the dinner table betrayal. She rose early, as she always had, and brewed coffee in the familiar kitchen. The same kitchen where she'd once baked birthday cakes, stewed hearty soups, and wiped tiny handprints from the counters. That morning, her hands moved through old routines, but her heart felt distant, as if watching from a different room. Jason and Samantha were packing for a weekend getaway. A couple's weekend, Samantha had called it, tossing the words carelessly as she zipped her suitcase. Jason, as always, avoided Ruth's eyes. Not once did they ask if she needed anything. Not once did they invite her along. When the door closed behind them, Ruth stood alone in the still house. And that was when she knew. She would not stay. Leaving wasn't an act of bitterness. It was an act of self-preservation. Too often, elders delay this choice out of loyalty, out of love, out of fear. Many hope that if they stay just a little longer, things will improve, that the family will remember who they once were. But here's a hard truth. The longer you remain where you're not respected, the harder it becomes to remember your own worth. Ruth had given them time. She had given them everything. Now it was time to give herself something too, peace. She packed a small suitcase with a few clothes. Important documents, her rosary, and the leather-bound notebook, a quiet chronicle of a lifetime. She left no dramatic note, no confrontation. Only her house key, placed neatly on the kitchen table beside a folded dish towel she'd washed and dried that morning. Then, with aching knees, she took the bus across town. No taxi, no help. At the care home, the woman at the front desk handed her a form. Ruth smiled and said, "I just like peace and quiet. It's only temporary." But inside she felt hollow. And here's something many won't tell you: the first night alone in a new place after decades spent holding a family together is one of the hardest nights you'll ever face. That evening, Ruth lay in a narrow bed in a small room that smelled faintly of bleach and boiled peas. She stared at the ceiling and wondered, had I truly become a burden? If you've ever asked yourself that question, you're not alone. Nearly 40% of seniors who move into care facilities report feelings of guilt even when the move is necessary. But Ruth's story didn't end in that question, because somewhere beneath the sadness, a quieter voice stirred. What if they're wrong? And that single thought became the spark for what came next. Because sometimes choosing to leave isn't giving up. It's stepping toward a future you can't yet see. For Ruth, that future would begin with an unexpected phone call and a visit to an old friend with a key to a truth that would change everything. It was a quiet morning when Ruth picked up the phone, its smooth receiver cold against her ear, her fingers trembling just slightly. "James," she said softly. It had been years since she'd spoken to her husband's old friend and lawyer. "Do you remember the house deed?" A pause. Then James's familiar voice, calm and steady. "Yes, Ruth. I remember everything about that day." 3 days later, Ruth sat in his office, an old space filled with the scent of leather and time. The same dusty books, the same oak desk, where years ago she and her husband had once prepared for the uncertain road ahead. James pulled out a thick manila folder, sliding it across to her with quiet reverence. "There it is," he said. "Your name, the address, signed, witnessed, recorded. The house has been legally yours since 1994. Ruth's hands were steady as she opened the folder. And there it was, proof. Ink on paper. A signature that carried the weight of love and foresight. Her husband had made sure of it, knowing even in the shadow of cancer that he didn't want her to ever feel homeless, to ever feel like a guest in the home she had built. She wasn't just someone who ate. She was the owner of the house. For many seniors, this moment of discovery never comes. In fact, thousands of American elders unknowingly relinquish rights to property they have spent a lifetime maintaining. In complex family arrangements, especially those involving second marriages or blended households, legal protections often go unreviewed for years. And here's the truth. If Ruth hadn't asked, she might never have known. That's why legal leverage matters, if you are watching this and wondering about your own rights. Here are a few vital steps to consider. Locate the deed. Even if you believe you know who owns the house, request a copy from your county clerk's office or through a trusted attorney. Understand survivorship clauses. Many joint ownership deeds include language about what happens upon the death of a spouse. Know what yours says. Review wills and trusts. Just because something was said around the dinner table doesn't make it legally binding. The written word matters most. Keep documentation updated. As James reminded Ruth, keeping property records current can make all the difference if disputes arise. Seek legal advice. DIY solutions often backfire. A brief consultation with an elder law attorney can save years of heartache later. For Ruth, seeing her name on that deed was more than legal validation, it was personal vindication. All the invisible labor, all the uncounted sacrifices she had never asked for charity. The home was hers, and now she held the power to decide what came next. Not in bitterness, not in haste, but with clarity and intention. And that intention would soon become a plan to turn her newfound leverage into something lasting. Because sometimes the greatest act of love isn't holding on, it's knowing when to let go. Ruth left James's office that afternoon with the manila folder pressed to her chest. Not like a weapon, not like a shield, but like a truth finally reclaimed. Outside, the air smelled of rain-soaked leaves. A city bus whooshed past the world, moving on as though her life hadn't just shifted on its axis. But inside her, something had indeed changed. Not anger, not revenge, balance. For too long, Ruth had lived in their house, but the truth was they had been living in hers. And now she faced a decision that many in her place might struggle with. What do you do with power once it's back in your hands? Ruth could have confronted them. She could have marched back into that kitchen with the deed in one hand and years of resentment in the other. But no, she chose something stronger. Quiet action. She called James again. I want to sell it, she said, her voice steady, quietly. And with those words, a plan began to take shape, one that would transform her pain into purpose. Here's something many families overlook. When it comes to property, how you sell is just as important as whether you sell. Ruth understood this instinctively. She didn't want drama. She wanted dignity. So here are the steps she and James followed. Steps you too can consider if ever faced with a similar crossroads. Title review. They double-checked that all documentation was current and airtight. Disclosures. A full property disclosure was prepared to avoid future legal disputes. Valuation. A fair market appraisal was conducted, essential for setting a realistic sale price. Private listing. To maintain discretion, they chose a private sale through a trusted agent, minimizing neighborhood gossip. Escrow protections funds were secured in an escrow account to ensure a clean financial transfer. Silent notification. The buyers would notify the current occupants only after the sale was complete, ensuring that the decision was irreversible. Now let's talk about common pitfalls, because this is where many well-intentioned seniors get trapped. Emotional confrontation. Publicly announcing your intentions before legal steps are finalized can invite sabotage or manipulation. Family guilt trips. Expect resistance. Be prepared with written records and legal backing, not just emotional arguments. Underestimating tax implications. Depending on your state and federal exemptions, capital gains tax may apply. Always consult an accountant first, neglecting your own needs. Selling a family home can feel like letting go of an identity. Have emotional support in place, whether through friends, counselors, FEDAs, or support groups. For Ruth, each document she signed was another stitch in a new fabric of life, a future crafted not out of bitterness, but from wisdom, hard-earned. When the final document crossed James's desk, Ruth's hands didn't tremble. She remembered birthday parties in that backyard, the smell of Christmas ham, the feel of her husband's hand in hers the day they crossed that threshold together. But now, it was time for the house to become something new. And in making that choice, Ruth chose herself not for the first time in her life, but perhaps for the first time unapologetically. She left James's office that day with more than a sail in motion. She carried the quiet knowledge that sometimes letting go is the most profound form of love we can offer to ourselves. But Ruth wasn't done yet. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, certified mail, one from the bank, one from the real estate office, another a hand-delivered notice informing them they had 30 days to vacate. Ruth didn't wait by the phone, but she knew it would ring. And when it did, the voices on the other end carried every note of disbelief, of entitlement, of anger that years of quiet labor could no longer silence. You evil old woman. You sold our house. This was our home. Samantha's voice cracked, shrill with fury. Ruth's reply was soft measured. No, it was my home. You just lived there, rent-free, just as I once fed you both. And with that, she hung up, no further words needed. Here's the thing. Confrontation does not have to mean conflict. For Ruth, this wasn't about revenge. It was about recognition. Too often, families descend into bitterness when power shifts. Words are weaponized. Decades of love are reduced to accusations. But Ruth understood something vital. You cannot force someone to see your worth, but you can refuse to let them define it. When Jason called next, his voice was no longer angry, it was broken. We're going to lose everything. Samantha's crying every day. I should have stopped her. I should have said something, and Ruth. She let him speak. When he finished, she answered with the words she had rehearsed quietly in her heart. I'm not taking anything from you. I'm only reclaiming what you thought I had forgotten. I'm not asking for love. I'm asking for recognition. A pause followed. Then the question she knew would come. Is there any way you can undo it? Her reply was simple truth. I gave everything to raise you, and I never kept score. But the moment your wife opened her mouth and you said nothing, something changed. I don't want your money. I don't even want your apology. I just want my silence back. And this is how I earn it. Now let's pause here, because this is where many people stumble. When finally standing up for themselves, it's tempting to seek validation or apology. But true confrontation is not about forcing remorse. It's about reclaiming your own peace. Here are a few practical tips inspired by Ruth's approach for handling these emotionally charged moments. Stay grounded in facts, not feelings. Use calm, factual language. The house was legally mine. I have the deed, rather than emotional accusations. Set clear boundaries. Know what you will and will not tolerate. Refuse to engage in cycles of guilt or blame. Avoid the trap of rehashing the past. Stick to the present action. I have made my decision. I am moving forward. Prioritize your own peace over their reaction. Their feelings are not your responsibility. Rehearse your message. Having a few simple, clear sentences prepared can help you stay calm and focused. Ruth's strength wasn't in her words, it was in her unwavering clarity. And as she hung up the phone that final time, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Stillness. Not triumph, not bitterness, just a calm knowing that she had acted and that was enough. Because sometimes the loudest act of love is not rescuing those who failed to protect you. It is standing firmly in your own truth and letting that truth speak for itself. And with that truth secured, Ruth was ready to build something greater than her own peace, something that would serve others who had walked her path. When the sale was final and the funds cleared, Ruth didn't rush out to buy new clothes or book a cruise. She didn't seek revenge. She sought purpose. For days she sat quietly with her tea, the leather-bound notebook on her lap, turning the pages of her life, the sacrifices, the milestones, the love given freely. And one thought rose again and again. No one should feel forgotten, not after decades of care, not after a lifetime of giving. And so the idea of Haven House was born. It wasn't about grandeur. Ruth wasn't trying to build an institution. She wanted a home, a space where women and men like her, cast aside by the very families they had once carried, could find dignity and warmth again. On the east side of town, she found it a small building with 4 units. A sagging porch, faded paint, but good bones. This isn't exactly luxury, the agent had said. I'm not looking for luxury, Ruth replied. I'm looking for use. And here's where Ruth's story offers lessons for anyone dreaming of turning pain into purpose. Start with what you know. Ruth knew what it felt like to be unseen. She designed Haven House to meet the needs she once had. Companionship, respect, a voice. Build a network. She called in Favors James for legal structure, a local handyman named Tommy whose own mother had been in a care home. They painted walls, fixed plumbing, planted herbs in bathtub gardens. Focus on community, not charity. Haven House wasn't about pity. It was about belonging. No one here proves their worth to stay the sign at the entrance read, Honor each story. Ruth invited Helen to be the first resident. Then came Miss Beatrice Marion and Roland, a widower who loved to cook. Each brought more than needs. They brought life. Keep it simple. Ruth didn't burden herself with bureaucracy. She ran Haven House with heart and common sense shared meals, laughter knitting circles, Sunday tea. Of course, there were challenges. Ruth had to navigate local zoning rules, insurance requirements, property taxes. But here's an important point. Many seniors underestimate their ability to lead projects after retirement. In truth, decades of managing households, caregiving, and budgeting create powerful leadership skills. Skills Ruth used to great effect, and common pitfalls. Overcommitting resources. Ruth was careful. She reinvested proceeds wisely, keeping funds aside for maintenance and emergencies, failing to ask for help. She built a small advisory circle, James, Tommy, and a retired social worker named Mary, neglecting self-care. Ruth made sure she still had time for her own joy, knitting, gardening, quiet afternoons on the porch. And the result? Haven House became more than a shelter. It became a statement that love and value do not expire with age or usefulness, as Roland once said while chopping tomatoes. We're alive today because someone once called you a leech. Ruth had laughed then, a laugh full of release, not bitterness. Pain had been transformed into purpose, and that purpose now rippled outward, touching lives beyond the walls of Haven House. But even as the house filled with new voices and stories, one last chapter remained for Ruth to write, one final conversation that would close the circle on her journey. It was a quiet spring afternoon, the kind where the sun drifts lazily through leaves and time itself seems in no hurry. Ruth sat on the porch of Haven House, a chipped teacup in hand. The familiar hum of voices floated from the garden, Helen and Roland bickering over green beans, Miss Beatrice knitting under the pergola. And then through the gate, a figure appeared. Jason. He looked older, not from years, but from burden. Shoulders slumped, eyes weary. "I know I don't deserve to be here," he said softly. Ruth motioned for him to sit. "We lost the house. Samantha left. I should have said something. I wanted to say, I'm sorry." Still, Ruth said nothing at first. Instead, she opened a small box beside her chair and pulled out a photograph, Haven House in its early days. Paintbrushes in hand, laughter in the air. She handed it to Jason. "You built this?" he asked. "With the money from our house." She nodded. Why Ruth finally spoke. "Because I ate your rice for 1 year, Jason. But you ate mine for 30. I'm only collecting a little interest." Tears welled in his eyes. "I forgot who you were," he whispered. "No," Ruth said gently. "You remembered too late." He looked down, voice trembling. "Can I help with the house with the others?" Ruth smiled, soft but firm. "This place doesn't need your guilt. It needs your growth. Live better. Love better. That's how you honor what I gave." Before he left, she handed him a blank page, a copy of a deed template. "Go fill this with something worthy." He held it like gold. "I will." And for the first time in years, Ruth believed him. Later that evening, Ruth opened her leather-bound notebook once more. She had recorded so many moments in its pages, money given, milestones, shared sacrifices made in silence. But now she added one final entry, 2023. Sold the house, built a new one for those like me. Value immeasurable. She closed the book with a soft sigh, because here's the truth. Ruth had come to understand legacy isn't built in grand gestures. It's built in the quiet moments where we choose to act with love, even after love wasn't returned. If you're watching this and wondering how to begin writing your own final chapter, know this. Start documenting your journey. Whether it's a simple journal, a video diary, or a collection of letters, capture your story. Your sacrifices matter. Preserve legal clarity. Review your will, your property deeds, your wishes. Make sure your voice will still be heard when you're no longer there to speak. Decide what you want to leave behind, not in things, but in meaning. Whether it's a house like Haven House, a scholarship, a letter to a grandchild, choose to leave love in action. And most of all, don't wait. The quiet chapters of life deserve just as much attention as the loud ones. As Ruth sat watching the sun dip behind the garden, she smiled. Not because everything had been made right, but because she had reclaimed her voice. And if you're here listening, know this. So can you. Your story isn't over. Your value didn't end with your usefulness. And it is never too late to start writing your next chapter. Because sometimes the most powerful kind of ending is simply a beautiful new beginning. And with that, dear friends, thank you for joining us on Ruth's journey. If this story stirred something in your heart, I invite you to subscribe to Grandma True Stories, where every voice matters and no life is forgotten. Until next time, be kind to yourself. You are worthy. You're home.